We'll go ahead and kick things off here. Just want to thank everyone for joining us today. We're really excited for the conversation we're about to have. We're joined by both Ryan Hodapp and then Thomas Krates with Ryan is with ARK Invest and Thomas with Resolute Investment Managers, I believe is the correct name for them. Hopefully I got it right. But both of their teams are really supportive in what we're doing here with Raccoon as we try to learn about different types of investments and support our clients. And so we're happy to have them both here today, but I'll let them do their own introductions. And thank you again for joining. If you have questions as we go on, please go ahead and use the chat function within Zoom. And then if you don't want to use the chat function, you're welcome to email us at info@raccoongroup.com, and all our team members here in the office will get that email and be able to forward them on so we can answer any of your questions. But it should be a great interactive day, and we'll go through the presentation, but you can feel free to ask your question anytime, but also we'll have a dedicated Q&A section at the very end. So with that, maybe I pass to you first, Tom, and you can do your intro, and then we'll give it to Ryan.
Thank you, Kyle. Tom Kreitz. I work with Resolute Investment Managers, and I have Ryan Hodapp here with me. Ryan is one of our ARK specialists who can speak very openly about innovation. And so, Ryan, I'll let you get started.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you guys so much for having us, and good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Ryan Hodapp, ARK Invest Product Specialist for Resolute. Resolute being a key distribution partner of ARK's. And if you're not familiar with ARK, ARK is a investment firm that was founded by Cathie Wood a little over 10 years ago. And everything that ARK does centers around identifying, researching, and ultimately investing in disruptive innovations and disruptive technologies. Now, as you can see here, I'm going to take you through this presentation called the Investment Opportunity Report, Invest Today and the Big Ideas of Tomorrow. This report, this presentation is a subset of a much bigger research presentation that ARK puts together each and every year called Big Ideas. And what we do in Big Ideas-oriented discussions is we talk about, number one, the long-term opportunity that ARK is seeing in the various technologies they're researching. And also, number two, we talk about how they might change how we work, live, and play. So today, the way today's conversation is going to go is I'm going to spend just a few quick minutes at the outset, kind of talking about the 30,000 foot view opportunity set that ARK is seeing in this overall disruptive innovation space. Then we're going to spend the great majority of our time talking about those big ideas and specifically talking about the underlying technologies that they're researching. So with that, let's jump right in and start with the 30,000 foot view. There we go. Okay, there are 5 what we call general purpose technology platforms where ARK centers most of their research around. You can see them here: public blockchains, AI, multiomics, so think all things genomics and life sciences, energy storage, and robotics. If you look at the combined public market value of that sort of basket of innovation, if you will, it's worth something like 12 trillion in the public markets today. ARK thinks that same basket can grow to in excess of 140 trillion by the end of the decade. Now, that is a big number no matter how you slice it. So it does beg the question, how the heck are we going to get there? Well, there are a couple things going on in the economy we think might help. First of all we are seeing is costs fall across a whole host of technologies. AI training costs are falling rapidly. I'll talk about that later. The cost of batteries going into electric vehicles is falling. Heck, the cost to map the human genome, it was $2.7 billion a couple decades ago. Now you can do it for a couple $100. Here's why that's important. As all of these various technologies kind of roll down their cost curves, i.e. they become more cost effective, it eventually hits a tipping point where you see a very powerful pickup in unit demand and growth, which of course we like to see. So things become more affordable, that drives adoption and growth. So number one, costs are falling. And number two, these technologies, many of them are converging. And what we mean by that is a lot of these technologies are sort of feeding into each other, which is further driving adoption and growth. And AI is certainly at the center of that because AI has become this big sort of enabling technology that's enabling all kinds of different businesses. And I'll give you some real world examples of that a little bit later on. So we think it's this confluence of both falling costs and this idea that these technologies are converging. That's a couple of the notable reasons why ARK is so constructive on this overall disruptive innovation space. Now, one more 30,000-foot view thing I want to mention that's in the broader Big Ideas deck that's not in this particular deck. There's an interesting slide that actually shows the history of GDP growth, i.e. economic growth, going back since the dawn of man. And what you'll see is GDP growth will kind of bump along for a period, and then you'll have these big step function jumps due to some sort of new innovation. Maybe it was agricultural innovation. Maybe it was the Industrial Revolution. But you'd have this kind of flatline, and then big jump. And it happens several times over the course of history. Right now, we're sitting at around 3% GDP growth, plus or minus. The provocative part of the story is ARK thinks that there's a very real scenario where GDP growth could jump to in excess of 7% by the end of the decade. I'm going to tell you a few real world stories of how that actually might come to fruition. So keep an eye out for that throughout the rest of the presentation. Okay, that's a 30,000-foot view. Now let's get into the good stuff. What you see here on this page is a series of thematics, and underpinning each of these thematics is the individual technologies that I'm going to talk about. So next-gen internet, we're going to talk about AI. Autonomous tech and robotics, we're going to talk about robotaxis, energy, and humanoid robots. Digital assets, we're going to talk about Bitcoin and something called stable coins. Genomic revolution, we're going to talk about everything from drug development, AI drug development companies to CRISPR gene editing companies. And then we're going to finish up by talking about reusable rockets in the space exploration section. So let's start off with artificial intelligence. AI in our mind continues to be the biggest of the big ideas. It's just the ultimate convergence technology. I mentioned earlier, it's just a big enabler. You see this concept here in the middle of the slide, neural networks. That is essentially AI that's designed after the human brain, and it's enabling everything from autonomous mobility, like robotaxis, which we'll talk about later, to improving the analytics of DNA sequencers. And on this very next page, there are some real world examples. AI is enabling Tesla's full self-drive capability. AI is enabling companies like Recursion to develop drugs using artificial intelligence. So again, it's this big enabling / convergence technology. Now, I'm going to, along the way, kind of compare and contrast some of the things we talked about last year and then bring you up to the present. As I think about all things AI, last year when we were given a lot of these big ideas presentations, number one, and I already teased this, we talked a lot about how AI training costs are falling rapidly. If you've seen any of these like chat bots like ChatGPT, there's what's called large language models that are powering them. Well, there is a cost, both on the hardware and software side of things, in terms of feeding those large language models tons and tons of data. That is what's called training costs. Well, those aggregate AI training costs are falling at a rate of 75% per year. When you roll down a cost curve that quickly, it just helps democratize the technology and allow more businesses and industries to actually use it, which is one of the reasons I think AI is growing so rapidly. It's just become more affordable. And then secondly, we spent a lot of time talking about how AI is going to be a huge productivity enhancer throughout the rest of the decade. We think AI may uplift the productivity of what we call knowledge workers. So think everything from paralegals to software developers. We could see their productivity go up by a factor of 4 to 5x by the end of the decade due to artificial intelligence. This year, the big topic we're talking about, and this is going to be the big buzzword throughout the rest of the decade, it's something called agentic AI or AI agents. We're going to eventually get to the point where we're either going to be able to talk into our phone or with a simple text prompt say, hey, AI agent, I'm looking for a pet-friendly hotel in Denver, Colorado, and can you automatically pay for that with my Venmo digital wallet? The AI agent will go scrape the internet and quickly come up with a curated response. You hit go and you're off and running. Compare that to what that process looks like now. First of all, you go to Google, you search for the hotel. Google gives you 10 links based on who paid the most to be at the top of the search algorithm. Then you got to figure out which one's pet friendly. Then you got to punch in your credit card info, etc. This is a real world example of how AI is going to be a big productivity uplifter throughout the rest of the decade. So we think there's going to be a number of different consumer oriented businesses that are going to use these AI agents. Okay, next up, autonomous tech and robotics. And this is the longest section, so we're going to go through a few different topics here. We're going to talk about robotaxis. We're going to talk about energy of all things. And then thirdly, we're going to talk about humanoid robots. So first of all, robotaxis. Last year, when we were talking about robotaxis, this is another example of a technology that's very much going to be driven by lower costs. If you look over the past almost century, the cost per mile to drive a car really hasn't changed, something like $1.10. Well, ARK thinks a fully autonomous robotaxi powered by deep learning AI, which is another term for AI powered after the human brain, we think it could be held for as low as 25 cents per mile. Well, why would it be so much cheaper? Well, first of all, you don't have to pay a human to drive because this is a fully autonomous robotaxi, no human driver. Secondly, you don't have to pay to park. Thirdly, and this is the tough one people have a tough time getting their arms around, it is going to be safer. It's absolutely going to be safer. Why? Well, we as humans are more distracted than we've ever been when we've driven due to our cell phones. We've got texts and tweets and all kinds of things coming at us, and driving's become pretty dangerous. Something like 85% of accidents are due to human error. A fully autonomous robotaxi powered by deep learning AI is not going to be distracted by your cell phone. And literally within the past 24 hours, Tesla actually just launched their safety stats, and they tweeted this, I think it was like 17 hours ago or something like that. They actually said of those people who have used it was one of their full autonomous capabilities, it's been 10 times safer than the human-driven Teslas. So there's a real world example of that safety factor already starting to kick in. As we fast forward to the present and some of the new slides, this slide, what it shows is over the past several years, there are a number of companies and or auto manufacturers at one point in time had announced some sort of robotaxi service, that they were going to launch some sort of robotaxi service. Fast forward to the present, and the great majority of them, there is just no expectation of launch whatsoever, with two exceptions. One would be Waymo, which is created by Google. They launched several years ago. And the second is Tesla. They are getting ready to launch a robotaxi service in Austin next month in June. I myself finally got to try a Waymo a handful of weeks ago in San Francisco, of all things. And I say that because it's a city that does have quite a bit of terrain. And I'm here to live the tale. Everything went fine. It was a nice, safe, smooth ride. It was the most future tech experience I've experienced in a very long time, because the car pulls up, again, no human driver. You have to put your phone next to the door, and then when you do it, the handle pops out. You get in, the car starts talking to you. I mean, it was just really, really cool, really kind of sci-fi tech in some ways. Waymo themselves, I think they're annualizing at something like 9 million miles per year. For all the success that Waymo's had out of the gates, we actually think Tesla's going to be the bigger winner in this particular space for two important reasons. Number one, Tesla just has a huge data advantage over Waymo. All those Waymos that are driving in San Francisco and Los Angeles and Phoenix, I think they're averaging something like 200,000 miles per day. All the Teslas that you see driving all around the country, they're logging 10 million miles worth of data per day. Here's why that's important. I mean, number one, all things being equal, it means Tesla could or should be safer. And secondly, and I found this out the hard way in Los Angeles, Waymo is what's called geofenced, and it's a fancy way of saying there are only so many places that they can actually go. I was trying to queue up a Waymo in Los Angeles several weeks ago, and I found out that the ride was going to be 15 to 20 minutes longer than an Uber equivalent. It's because Waymos cannot go on the highway. They don't have the data to allow that to become a reality. We don't think that's going to be an issue for Tesla. Secondly, and you can see it here, Tesla has a cost structure that's much lower than Waymo's. And I think it's just because Tesla's figured out ways to vertically integrate a lot of their business and automate things to some degree as well. Where Waymo, for example, is partnered up with companies like Jaguar, and they've got a lot of expensive sensors around their cars, et cetera. And so what that means practically is, number one, there's a very real scenario where Tesla's able to operate that business in a more profitable fashion. And secondly, there's also a very real scenario where Tesla could undercut Waymo on price, which would further drive adoption. To tie a bow on this robotaxi section, this is going to be one of the first examples of a technology where we're probably going to create GDP growth that does not exist right now. Because if you think about this, you're going to start to see this technology in major urban areas, and it may replace the commute for some people because it might be more cost effective. If you think your typical commute, you're not exactly doing anything important, right? It's idle time. What if instead you could be sitting in the back of a car and doing work, watching your favorite Netflix show, participating in e-commerce, whatever the case may be? You would be creating economic activity that does not exist today. Could be pretty constructive for global GDP growth. All right, next up, energy. Why is there an energy section in a disruptive innovation presentation? It has everything to do with topic number one, and that is artificial intelligence. As AI proliferates and we build out more and more of these data centers that are going to be used to power AI, that is going to consume a fair amount of power and electricity over time. And so we're going to need to make some investments in some clean energy tech to help basically solve that demand issue that's going to develop more and more over the course of the rest of the decade. Believe it or not, one of the early tips of the spears is turning out to be nuclear power of all things. Microsoft, Amazon, Google, three of the largest technology companies on the planet, they have all announced that they're making some sort of investment in nuclear. Now, make no mistake, nuclear is not going to be the only solution. So we're going to have to invest in other things like wind and solar. And then Tesla themselves actually has a really fast growing energy storage business where, for example, they might have almost what I kind of call an energy farm, where if there's a big run on the grid, maybe in a state like Texas, they can kind of dial things up and dial things down as demand waxes and wanes. But not to put too fine or simple a point on it, again, as we spend more and more money on these AI data centers, and I think I've heard they could consume upwards of 9% of our grid by the end of the decade, we're going to need to invest in some of these clean energy tech solutions to help solve that demand. And lastly, in this section, humanoid robots. Looking back to last year when I would talk about all things robotics, I would often talk about Amazon just because they are one of the biggest users of robots on the planet. If you haven't noticed, from the time you click buy on Amazon's website to the time that little brown box shows up on your front door, that time has been compressing dramatically. Just this past week, I ordered a bunch of K-Cups for my Keurig coffee maker. They showed up the same day. The reason that's happening is the AI behind Amazon's robots is just getting better and better at picking and placing things in boxes. That is that deep learning AI where it's just learning and getting better and better through repetition. This year, there's a couple interesting topics that we talk about when we think about just all things robotics, automation. Number one, we talk about humanoid robots eventually replacing what I like to call unpaid labor. And then secondly, we want to address the potential for job losses with all things robotics, automation, AI, because that is certainly a question we get a lot in client events in particular. All right, first of all, robotics replacing, again, unpaid labor. As much as we hate to say it, we as humans have a number of tasks when we're at home that are essentially the equivalent of unpaid labor. One very simple example would be doing the dishes. Think about it, right? You take the dishes, you get them out of the sink, put them in the dishwasher, you eventually got to put them up on the shelves, put them in the drawers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What if we could eventually get to the point where a humanoid robot could take on those types of tasks? Once again, we as the human could go on and do other things. Watch your favorite streaming show, do some work, participate in e-commerce. We could create GDP growth that does not exist right now. Secondly, automation, basically the question we get is, as automation, robotics, and AI proliferate, isn't everybody and their brother going to lose their jobs? There will be some disruption, make no mistake, but we don't think it's going to be the Armageddon scenario many pundits would lead you to believe. And that's just because when we see tectonic shifts in technology, like we're seeing with AI, it ends up being job substitution as opposed to outright job replacement, i.e. people go on to bigger and better things. Well, this year, we build on that concept a little bit differently in that one of the other interesting things we've noticed is that as various automation technologies have been invented, sometimes in a very perverse way, we actually can create new jobs that don't exist at the time. In the Big Ideas presentation, we talk about the invention of the washing machine. Evidently, at one point in time, it took about 15 hours to do the laundry, and because of that, people would only do the laundry once every 3 months. Lo and behold, we get the eventual invention of the washing machine. You had to go out and buy it, you had to pay to power it, and thirdly, if it would break, you had to pay someone to come and repair it. Washing machine repairman was not a job that existed until the invention of the washing machine. Fast forward to the present. There's now a job called prompt engineer. A prompt engineer's whole job is to, when they're using tools like ChatGPT, make sure they're asking the right appropriate questions, they're wording questions appropriately so they get the correct output on the back end. Prompt engineer is a job that did not exist a few short years ago. So again, in a very, very perverse way, some of these new automating technologies can actually lead to new jobs, which is pretty exciting to think about. Okay, Digital assets. All right, here's what we're going to talk about: Bitcoin and a maybe lesser known concept called stable coins. So with Bitcoin, again, kind of comparing and contrasting last year and bringing us up to the present, last year when I personally talked about Bitcoin, I spent a lot of time talking about sort of the unique supply and demand dynamics of Bitcoin. The way the software code behind Bitcoin is written, there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin minted. So if we know the supply is finite, it begs the question, what will drive demand? Well, here it's much more of an international emerging market story than I think a lot of people realize, for a few different reasons. First of all, imagine if someone from South America comes to the US to work and they want to send money back to their family. Well, historically, you'd have to do that via Western Union. It would cost 8, 10, 12%. The money might get there in 3 to 5 days. What if there's a technology that could get it there in 10 minutes and it would only cost 1% or 2? What if you lived in a Middle Eastern regime where the government can seize your assets? Bitcoin is seizure proof. What if you live in a country where it either has persistent high double-digit inflation, or in some nations where the government may just decide to devalue their currency by 2/3 overnight? Bitcoin is completely decentralized from any sort of government control. So there are a lot more interesting use cases for Bitcoin overseas relative to the US. Here in America, Bitcoin right now is much more of an investment akin to kind of what we call digital gold. And the new demand lever that came online last year was the advent of spot Bitcoin ETFs. Now, I'm not going to mention any specific like tickers or anything along those lines, but the aggregate spot Bitcoin ETF complex, by any measure, was one of the most successful ETF exchange traded fund launches in history. Because what it allowed investors, advisors, institutions to do was basically plug and play with Bitcoin like they would any other asset class. And so that's the new demand lever here in the US. One final thought on Bitcoin. If we look at the chart here on the right, I just think this is interesting. What this chart shows is that, believe it or not, Bitcoin volatility actually recently hit an all-time low. Now, make no mistake, Bitcoin is still more volatile than most asset classes out there. Make no mistake. However, what you'll notice on that chart is the trend is going down and down and down. And we think that may have something to do with the institutional adoption of Bitcoin. What we think is happening is, as Bitcoin goes on these strong runs, institutions are capturing those profits and redeploying elsewhere. Conversely, Bitcoin will eventually go through some big dips. They're buying that dip and stepping in and buying the dip. And so that natural kind of rebalancing factor, we think, is slowly sanding off the volatility of Bitcoin over time. So we don't know if that will continue, but it'll be interesting to observe to see if it might. And then lastly in this section, stable coins. What is a stable coin? Think of a stable coin as a digital asset that is designed to replicate a fiat currency like the US dollar. The way they're getting there is they're basically investing in US treasuries, basically as their reserves. And to give you a sense for how quickly this space is growing, as we look at some of the biggest owners of US treasuries in the world, most of them are actually large nation states. So like the two largest owners of US treasuries are actually China and Japan. Well, as we think of some of the largest stablecoin providers out there, there's two companies, Tether and Circle. Tether and Circle right now are in the top 20 in terms of their ownership of US treasuries. That gives you a sense for how rapidly this particular space is growing. Now, let me finish up with a real world use case for a stable coin, just to kind of make it a little bit more crystal clear in terms of how it can be used. One of the analysts at ARK, a gentleman by the name of Lorenzo, is originally from Argentina. And a handful of weeks ago, he was talking about he and his wife were getting ready to go back to the homeland. What he did before his trip was he put some stable coins on a digital wallet on his cell phone, and in doing so, it allowed him to cross borders into Argentina and still have the stability of the US dollar in his pocket. He did not have to worry about whether or not Argentina was going through hyperinflation. He did not have to worry about whether Argentina was having wide currency swings. Again, he had the stability of the US dollar right on his phone. So kind of similar to what I said about Bitcoin, a lot of these digital assets, some of the use cases are much more global than I think a lot of people would realize. So interesting stuff going on there. All right, two more big topics, and then I would love to see if anyone has any questions. All right, the genomic revolution. This one's kind of a personal favorite of mine because at the end of the day, we're investing in companies that are trying to save people's lives and or head off disease like cancer. You'll notice two big important letters in the middle of this flywheel here, AI, artificial intelligence. So I think everyone's talking about AI through the lens of enterprise technology spending and the chat GPT of it all. But what we don't think people realize is the profound impact that AI is going to have on the healthcare space. So first of all, in the top right, there now are AI drug development companies. The typical drug development process right now is around 12 to 13 years. These AI drug development companies are already starting to knock 2 to 3 years off that process. And if things continue at pace, it's probably closer to 4 to 5 years. The reason that's important is it's going to allow drug companies to extend their patent runway, which should be good for profitability. Secondly, these companies are also driving down drug development costs by a factor of upwards of 4x. So I'll tell you why both of those things are important in a while, but it's going to have a meaningful impact on the return in the overall drug development space. As we pan to the left, AI is just going to improve the analytics of things like DNA sequencers, single cell RNA sequencers, and that therefore, as we go around the horn, is going to improve molecular diagnostics and in particular cancer screening. Unfortunately, people often don't realize they have cancer until they're showing symptoms, and that can often be stage 3, stage 4. What if instead we can uncover those markers for disease in our body at a much earlier stage? Well, one of the capabilities that's being developed, and it's kind of a silly term, it's called a liquid biopsy. That's a fancy term for a blood draw. We're getting to the point where we're going to be able to basically, through a simple blood draw, screen for multiple forms of cancer. What if we could just make cancer screening part of our annual routine? We could save thousands and thousands of lives. And then the other diagnostic cancer screen that's being developed is something called MRD testing, minimal residual disease. What MRD testing shows is once you've had cancer and you've gone through some sort of treatment, MRD testing shows the likelihood of whether or not that cancer might recur. And MRD testing is uncovering the likelihood of cancer recurrence up to 20 months earlier than more traditional screening. And then last but not least on this page, you see this box here that says cures. This is what's called CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing. I always like to say I'm not a geneticist, but I occasionally play one on TV. The way to think of CRISPR gene editing is you send an enzyme to a very specific spot on your DNA where something is broken. It clamps on and acts like a literal DNA scissors. It cuts out the bad stuff and brings in a bridge to right the ship. So this is a permanent change in your DNA. What's so exciting about this space is these companies are literally creating what could be functional outright cures. So we had some really exciting news. I think it was like late 2023. We had the first in history FDA approval of a CRISPR treatment, and it was specifically a treatment for people with sickle cell disease. People with those types of diseases often have to go in the hospital something like 18 times a year on an emergency basis for blood transfusions. We've heard instances now where patients with one single dose have gone something like 4 years without a single blood transfusion. Completely life-altering. I myself, I'm a bit of a podcast junkie, and I was listening to a podcast last year, and the host interviewed the 4th person to receive the sickle cell CRISPR dose. The gentleman who received the dose, he talked about his experience with sickle cell. The pain was so bad, he would often pass out. He had just, all kinds of breathing issues. Post the CRISPR treatment, he was getting ready to go on an expedition to Mount Kilimanjaro, something he could have never imagined. And then one final story, because this literally hit within the past 2 weeks. Evidently, there was this consortium in Pennsylvania that just put together a custom CRISPR treatment for a 6-month-old baby who is going through some sort of life-threatening metabolic issues. The punchline of the story, I just read this over the course of a couple lines, was the mom eventually came in and saw her baby sitting up in a crib, and she said it's something she thought she would never see. Again, this is really exciting stuff. These companies are creating outright cures. So the last slide here, and we'll finish up with reusable rockets, and we'll get on to Q&A. I mentioned, ROI, the returns on drug development R&D are not good right now. It is a whopping 4%. Go buy a T-bill. Not a great business. Well, now, again, with these AI drug development companies, the way they're going to drive down costs significantly, extend patent runways, we think it's going to help reignite the return on investment in a way we've not seen in a very long time. So that's exciting from an investment perspective. Okay, final thing here. I'll go through reusable rockets real quick. if we look over the past several years, there are a lot of what I call rocket pundits who thought the idea of a reusable rocket was just completely laughable. Like, there's just no way we're going to be able to pull that off. I mean, from a cost perspective, if nothing else. Fast forward to the present, now we have SpaceX, their Falcon 9 rocket. Their turnaround time is 14 days. They're turning rockets around in 2 weeks, something I imagine NASA would probably kill for. Here's why that's important. Believe it or not, there are still 600 million households around the world who do not have broadband high-speed internet access. They could not be doing what we are doing right now. And maybe it's just because they live in remote areas or whatever the case may be. Now, because first of all, satellites are smaller and foldable, which means we can get more on a rocket, but more importantly, rockets are reusable. We're going to be able to get more satellites up in space and create what's called a low Earth orbit constellation network. And that's going to help us get broadband internet to those in remote areas who otherwise could not. There is yet another example of we will probably create GDP growth that does not exist right now. Because imagine if someone who doesn't have high-speed internet access all of a sudden could go onto a shopping website. Some of the things that we kind of take for granted each and every day could be very constructive for overall global economic growth. And then just on a very personal note, the other thing I think that this technology could be really good for, as someone who is a frequent traveler, I'm sitting in a hotel room as we speak. If you've at all been on a plane lately and used the Wi-Fi, the latency is still terrible. This could help solve that issue as well. All right, we talked about AI, robotics, gene editing, reusable rockets. I would love to see if anyone has any questions.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. Really, really excellent. A lot to cover there for sure. So maybe we'll start. We had a couple questions that came in, and maybe we'll start sort of, I think about this. I was in Arizona recently, and I got to visit a lab doing some real advanced gene editing actual research at Arizona State. And while I was there, you sit there and you look at it and you're like, this is so cool, right? Like you're hearing what they do, but then we come back to the office and we sort of look at the broader market, and the market doesn't look great, right? Like you see the performance of the actual stocks within it, right? Although the industry is growing quite a bit, the stocks themselves have not been big hits. So I was just curious, is it misunderstood? What are we kind of missing there, within that space?
Yep. Kathy Wood would tell you it's wildly misunderstood. I mentioned that I was in Los Angeles not too long ago. I was with Kathy in person, and she said, I think I'm going to write a book on this someday. She thinks the CRISPR stocks are kind of akin to where Tesla was in their early days, where it's just, I don't quite understand what these companies are doing or something along those lines. But I'll give you more specifics on what we think is misunderstood just in the healthcare analyst community at large. First of all, it's kind of what I call the shape of the revenue curve. You've got what healthcare analysts are used to is a guy like me, where you could set a clock to me taking a statin each and every day, right? There's a nice recurring revenue stream that they're used to from people that have to take drugs each and every day. Well, with these CRISPR treatments, the revenue is very front-end loaded because it is essentially a cure. So the revenue will be very front-end loaded, and then the companies will redeploy into other modalities. So they're just not used to the lumpiness of that revenue stream. And then secondly, we think that there's a misunderstanding that this is only going to be used to cure rare diseases. While that is certainly the early case, right? Sickle cell disease, there's a lesser known one called beta thalassemia. There's another one being developed for something called hereditary angioedema. We have horrific body swelling, you can close off your throat. There are also CRISPR treatments being developed for type 1 diabetes. So we think the total addressable market is much larger than I think the overall healthcare analyst community would believe. So those are the two big things we think are why they're mostly misunderstood. And the company that got the FDA approval in late 2023, I mean, they're literally in the process of dosing, I think it's upwards of 50 different patients as we speak, and it's a $2 million dose too. So, I mean, there's 100 million in revenue that we know is coming in the door, just like that, as but one real world example.
This is fun because, we talked about such a broad range of topics that I got to go from gene editing, maybe just thinking a little bit about cybersecurity. One of the questions that came in, obviously, we think about cybersecurity most often on the corporate side, right? Like
Yep.
our business relies on so much cybersecurity because we have to protect people's personal information, and that's critical. Now, one of the questions that came in is how is AI, if you have any idea, like if we think about how AI is changing cybersecurity, both for corporations, but maybe talking a little bit about how do we look at that when it comes to the actual individual and how the individual maybe is protected by AI?
Yeah, there's AI proliferating and what that means for cybersecurity. We often get asked about quantum computing, which will be a cybersecurity threat someday. So yeah, I mean, first of all, just at the enterprise level, to your point, and just writ large across the country and globe, we're going to need to spend more and more money on cybersecurity, because the threats, are going to get more and more difficult. But I think the personal AI question is really, really interesting, right? Because you've got all the deep fakes on social media and all that kind of stuff. And, I think, what was it, a couple of years ago, someone literally replicated President Biden's voice heading into the election. And that's when AI gets scary. I mean, make no mistake. And so that one little just thing to think about is, what if someone that sounds like your family member asks you for money? I would, one little suggestion is, go back and talk to your family after this Zoom and say, you all of a sudden have someone, your favorite cousin calls you asking you for $10,000. Have a family password, right? Something that only you guys would know. That way you don't get caught up in some sort of voice scam or something along those lines. So, because unfortunately, as a lot of these technologies proliferate, unfortunately, there are going to be bad actors. And there is going to be technology through cybersecurity to help block it. But there are still some bad actors that are going to get sneaky, and you have to be really
Well,
smart about those types.
I think, yeah, I think about it a lot where sometimes, the solution isn't there yet, right? Where we
Hmm.
look at Google now knows, or Apple, whoever your phone provider is, right,
Yeah.
knows when a spam call is coming in now, right?
Mhm.
And they alert you, potential spam call coming in. And
Yeah.
2 years ago that wasn't there,
Right.
and so we're going to see this more and more, and it's a little reactionary, I
Hmm.
would guess, which is unfortunate, right? Like you want it to be that proactive protection that's coming, but I think that the tools are there and companies are going to be vying to protect each of us while there's bad actors out there, because the more you can protect your data, the more trust that they're going to have with their kind of customer base.
Yeah. And basic blocking and tackling, right? Just always be smart about your passwords and all that kind of stuff that, it seems simple at heart, but then you always want something that's easy to remember. And it's hard to, to reconcile those two things sometimes.
Hmm. So I was actually in Phoenix recently, and I also rode in a Waymo. I've ridden in Waymos several times, both in the Phoenix area and also in San Francisco. San Francisco, very exciting with the hills
Hmm.
and the number of pedestrians for sure. But
Hmm.
they were actually starting to test the Waymos on the highway in Phoenix. So it was a new thing that they're starting to test.
Nice.
I would assume to gather that data
Yep.
that you're talking about, and so. And this is probably true for, I mean, much of AI or much of innovation, right? Is when we look at robo taxis, thinking about like how much infrastructure is missing there in order for Tesla or Waymo or whether it's one of the other companies, right, to go out there and actually have a fully functioning system without real big upgrades in infrastructure, say in highways or streets or sidewalks.
I don't think we have to worry as much about infrastructure spend because, I mean, so for example, so Tesla's getting ready to launch in Austin next month. While they are building their own kind of what they're calling cyber cab, and we're going to see that next year. It'll be built, purpose built. I mean, they talked a long time ago about building a car with no steering wheel, no pedals. There's only, one reason that would be built for. But in the meanwhile, the June launch in Austin, supposedly they're just using the Model Y, and then they're just going to purpose build the underlying kind of software and stuff like that. So the infrastructure, as I think about it, it's more at the company level and what their own costs are and all those kind of things, because it's just, will they be able to turn left across an intersection, right? It's the important factor is the AI behind the robotics. I mean, they are robots when all is said and done, to make sure that they're doing all the things. And there's wild things you wouldn't think about, right? You might go to Hawaii and the stop sign's blue. If your AI doesn't recognize that the stop sign's blue, That is a big, big issue. And that's why it's critical to have tons and tons of data fed into those AI models. So it's the robustness of the AI models where the investment really, really needs to be made for the safety factor, if nothing else, because the regulators are going to be watching this very, very closely. There was a third company. So Chevy did have cruise automation, and I think they've since like divested that. They had an instance where a human-driven car hit one of the cruise automation cars, so it wasn't the cruise car's fault. But when the cruise robotaxi got over, it drug a human 20 feet. Not a good thing, right? And that could be a lack of data. It didn't, maybe it didn't have the right sensors, all those kind of things. But again, that shows it's critical for the AI investment. It's critical to have the right sensors, and even how Tesla versus Waymo is appropriating that, right? If you've seen the Waymo, they've got all those sensors on the outside. Tesla has a different viewpoint on that. They think it should be done just with cameras because that is how they think that's how a human looks at the world. And so they're trying to replicate what a human would be doing when you're looking around kind of from a 360-degree perspective. So most of the investment, again, I'm coming full circle, should come at the company level. Now, the question behind the question then also is, as Tesla has to have these big AI data centers, right, to make sure, then there's that ripple effect. We need to invest in our energy infrastructure. That gets into nuclear energy storage and all that kind of stuff. So there will be a ripple effect, but it's more energy infrastructure build as opposed to kind of highway infrastructure build.
You wonder how long before these self-driving cars get so smart that they start looking down at their own cell phones.
The
It's a big
one piece of
distraction.
infrastructure that could be built is you may eventually see like some sort of like parking plate where they have to go and park somewhere and charge themselves. That could be part of the infrastructure build.
Yeah, I've actually seen that with the humanoid robots.
Yeah,
they have
where they plug into the wall kind of thing.
They come walk and they stand on a charging pad, and then the charging pad allows them to regenerate.
I saw that in a hotel in Los Angeles. Yep.
Yeah, pretty impressive. So briefly, you mentioned quantum computing. How come that's not a focus this year? I know it's been a focus in prior years. It was a big winner for a few months of last year in the stock market, but just curious kind of why it's fallen away.
Yeah, it's more to just not to oversimplify it. It's just not ready for prime time yet. We think it's probably before it has any kind of meaningful use. It's probably a decade down the road. I read some studies say it's 15 to 30 years. So a combination of the technology itself isn't ready, or we probably need those cost declines too to drive adoption too. So I imagine it's not going to be the cheapest technology to implement either. So yeah, it's not ready for prime time. Having said all of that, the one thing I think ARK is thinking about, other than the cybersecurity issue, right? Because if you get these supercomputers that can crack people's passwords and all that kind of stuff, that's why, again, I think cybersecurity companies are going to be really important. One other tail risk, if quantum computing were to eventually come to fruition, might be Bitcoin. What if some supercomputer could crack Bitcoin's cryptographic algorithm? That could be a risk. Once again, that is either further out or it may just be unlikely. I was reading a paper. So Google was the first company to kind of launch a quantum chip, and supposedly the quantum chip that they launched has 105 qubits. A qubit's just basically like a measure of the information it can store on the chip. I read a white paper, and evidently to crack Bitcoin's cryptographic algorithm, we would need a quantum chip with 4 million qubits. So a factor, multiples of the existing kind of infrastructure. So the thinking was, first of all, we're nowhere near 4 million relative to 105. But secondly, knowing that we have time ahead of us, there's also a real scenario where someone could come up with a 4 million qubit chip to counter that attack too. So there'll be time to kind of build out the defense where quantum is defending quantum, which is probably part of cybersecurity defense as well. So, but that's something they've certainly been thinking about, like what kind of codes can it crack, and Bitcoin could be in the crosshairs.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a period where the race for quantum computing really was almost a country-specific kind of U.S. versus China.
Sure.
Like we have to figure it out before they figure it out kind of scenario, because we're trying to prevent one of
national
those
security.
Yeah, where you're behind on your computing, you can't protect yourself.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
A real issue that came up. Maybe if we think about, if we're looking at these innovations, what what would be, like we talked about, whether there were infrastructure issues with highways and vehicles, or if we're
Mhm.
looking at AI, is the big impediment there your energy production and storage, or what, like when we're looking at innovation, what are kind of the big impediments we should be considering or thinking about when we're analyzing a company?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to vary from industry to industry, obviously. So yeah,
Yeah,
AI
of
would be
course.
power consumption. With the healthcare sector, even the CRISPR companies for that matter, how long does the FDA approval process, how does that last? Or just the FDA in general, are they streamlining processes? Are they innovation mindful? It sounds like we're making some strides there. They Number one, I think it was a handful of weeks ago, they announced that for monoclonal antibodies, so basically where you synthetically make proteins to replicate the antibodies in your body, they're moving away from animal testing in favor of some of those AI drug development companies that I had mentioned. That's pretty interesting, right? So it means because AI can essentially replicate a lot of things you could do with animals. So that was kind of encouraging, just innovation forward. And then secondly, they just announced that they're going to hire their first chief AI officer. Um, the first time in history for the FDA, and evidently they did a pilot study where they gave some of the FDA people some generative AI tools to put towards one of their review processes. And one of the review processes that evidently normally had taken 3 days, with the new generative AI tools, they got down to 6 minutes. So that stuff is really, really encouraging because that had been a hindrance, I think, for a long time, where you get a lot of, government red tape slowing things down, and like we're trying to cure people here, right? We want to save lives, and hopefully, we don't obviously want to sacrifice safety for that to happen. Make no mistake, but to bring these drugs to market, bring these cancer screening methodologies to market, it's good to see that the FDA is kind of moving in the right direction there. One that we didn't talk about, but there will have to be some infrastructure build, would be it's a technology called eVTOL. So it's called electric vertical takeoff and landing. We're eventually going to get to the point where we're going to have like the Jetsons air taxi, where if you're in downtown Manhattan and you just want to jump over traffic, it's going to be the equivalent of kind of an electric air taxi. That is cool. It's going to save time. It's going to be electric powered. However, guess what? You still are going to need some heliports and stuff like that to support whatever that particular volume might look like. So it's more aerial infrastructure. Well, I mean, it'll be on the ground, obviously, but
Well, you have to figure out low air traffic, right?
Mhm.
How that works
Yeah,
for
and then
sure.
FAA, because we're already going through our own
Mhm.
FAA issues as we speak. And so, yeah, drone technology, that'll be the same thing, right? As consumer companies start to deliver via drones, there's all kinds of FAA issues that will need to be solved for there, and that is certainly coming. Um, and then, yeah, like I said, I mean, with all things autonomous, the government's always going to be watching out for the safety factor because, again, we've both been in Waymos, right? There is no human driver. There is still a human somewhere in another location. If things go awry, they can step in and kind of, take the car to the side. We're seeing companies develop like autonomous trucks to be used for shipping, but it will be the same thing. The truck, while it will be autonomous and that's going to save money and time and all that kind of stuff, there's going to be a human somewhere making sure that things are truly, truly safe because the government is going to be watching that kind of stuff like a hawk.
Great. So coming up near the end here, so I always like to ask what people are excited for, but I think in this segment, it's all very exciting. But maybe if you were pulling something out of the hat for your favorite, what would be your favorite sort of theme when you're looking at kind of the big ideas for this year?
I mean, I know we've already talked about it, but I think in particular the gene editing companies, because it's got two things going for it. I mean, and we touched on them both. Number one, saving lives, creating functional cures, improving people's lives in ways they never would have expected. And by the way, the sector's been really, really beat up, right? And so, you know, if the businesses can kind of come back to life, we get the revenues come through, the FDA comes through for us all of a sudden. If we could reignite the valuations in a space that is saving lives, like that just feels like a huge, huge opportunity, and it is depressed. So that's the area, and I align with Kathy that way very much. Now, do we know what the exact timing of what that looks like, right? Because FDA approvals, even from company to company, will vary depending on if they're going through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and all that kind of stuff. Um, but I'm very hopeful in that particular space.
Good.
It gets
Well,
me excited.
no, saving lives is always a good thing.
Yeah.
I'm on board with that for sure. So, well, right here. So, if any clients didn't have their questions answered, or if you have follow-up questions, please feel free just to email a member of our team. ARK has, always worked really well with us, and we're really fortunate that if we can't answer your question, I'm sure Ryan or someone on his team would always be happy to answer any of your innovation-related questions, or maybe some random other questions as well. But again, Ryan, really want to thank you for your time today. Thank you for joining us, and thanks to all the attendees for your time. And we'll follow up next time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for having us, Kyle.